tourist, and the political scientist who sees the forest but no trees. If a historical analogy were needed to illuminate our current predicaments, the world of 1900 would probably serve more usefully than that of 1930. In the early 20th century, transnational flows of people, goods, and capital yielded not only global integration, but protectionist enthusiasms, the Yellow Peril, White Australia, and France de Board, exclusion acts in America, and pan-Germanic fantasies in Berlin and Vienna. The great powers fretted over their world position in the coming century. The new school of geopolitics was born. Nationalism had much to thank globalization for. It still does. Still, no one reading the newspapers today can escape at times a frisson of recognition on opening those of the 1930s. Demagogues exploited national or ethnic animosities to win or keep power. Internationalism, variously expressed as world bodies, transnational associations, and civil society, world revolution, free trade, open borders, collective security, or the earnest repudiation of any and all great power rivalry, fell prey to strident calls for national primacy. Sometimes, but not always, such calls accompanied attacks on democracy. Sometimes, but not always, they served the demagogues. Diverse governments and regimes, from Moscow to Washington and Tokyo, heeded the calls in diverse ways. Authoritarians who bridle at multilateral constraints abroad as well as constitutions and dissent at home might more readily take up the cry of the 1930s. Every man for himself. But they were not the only ones. To some observers, in particular those called realists, the 60 or 70 years of relative peace and prosperity that elapsed under the American aegis since 1945 seem aberrant, a historical accident unlikely to recur. Nothing in the scenery of the 1930s would surprise the realists among the international relations theorists now, other perhaps than the ink wasted on lamenting it. In its most elemental form, realism paints the world that way anyway, as an anarchic menagerie of states, each jostling for power, security, or advantage. However differently they treat their compatriots, however foreign to each other their ways at home, they obey the same logic once they step outside and eye one another. There, the world imposes on them its sovereign indifference to rules. It condemns them to compete, but not necessarily to fight, for they can resort to instruments that neutralize the threat of subversion or subjection. They can, for example, restore equilibrium by manipulating the balance of power, in which smaller states typically coalesce to arrest the emergence of a hegemon in their midst. Or they can deter by manifest pugnacity their greedier neighbors, or collude to eliminate or partition an inveterate troublemaker. But these tools provide no guarantees. In its different versions and manifestations, realism, still the dominant notion of explaining why nation-states behave toward one another the way they do, presents a world both anarchic and predictable, in which fitful events can reveal the recurrent sequence of threat and response to chroniclers astute enough to discern it. Many were unwittingly doing so before realism, neorealism, and their variants elevated premise into ever more sophisticated theory. Celebrated works of traditional diplomatic history presented war, peace, and conditions in between as outcomes in the struggle between modern states for survival, expansion, or tranquility. In the state of nature which Hobbes imagined, one of them began, violence was the only law, and life was nasty, brutish, and short. Though individuals never lived in this state of nature, the great powers of Europe have always done so. 2.5 millennia earlier, Thucydides had assumed much the same of the powers of his own day. Neither he nor his successors knew anything of realist thought in international relations, let alone the